Okay, class, this is day 18 of our civil rights chapter, unit 10 and 11. Today is actually our last day of notes for the year. We are going to be doing some test prep and then the test this week. Remember, the test is Friday from 1 to 2 p.m. And then next week, we're going to be starting a PBL where you're going to get a chance to write a law. But we'll worry about that a little bit later. Today, we're going to review the formative that hopefully you did yesterday. We're going to give you a heads up about some tickets that you can earn, and then we're going to finish up the section. So, as always, we'll start off with our objective. We're still describing how the hippies and the media turned against the Vietnam War and how that impacted the end of that war. And we're talking about the prepping for the Unit 10 and 11 test. So let's pick up where we were in the notes. But I did say I would let you know about tickets. So when you have your actual test, it is going to be posted as an assignment. But that assignment is only going to be open for 1 hour. And so you'll need to click on that and then fill out the form. And it's really going to feel very much like a normal test. To get you prepared for that, tomorrow I'm going to post that as a quote unquote assignment. It's not going to be worth any points, just so you get used to that clicking of that form and filling out. I'll just have like 2 or 3 questions. Are you ready? Did you study? Something like that. And your test will be just like that, except for 34 multiple choice, 2 short answer, and extended response. So we'll help you get ready for that. And of course, you can contact me if you have any questions. So, formative review. What areas of the mainstream did the youth or hippie movement affect? Well, of course, it was all of these and more: food, fashion, music. The huge difference in values between many hippies and their parents. Well, that is called the generation gap. That big difference between how you were raised versus your parents and how that particular generation gap was much larger than normal. What event do many people consider the culmination or pinnacle of the youth movement? That was, of course, Woodstock. And describe one positive and negative thing as a result of the youth counterculture movement. I think a positive thing, there's a couple different things you could list. Depending on your viewpoints, the end of the Vietnam War, increased awareness of civil rights, women's rights, other minority groups such as Hispanic American rights. Negative results, definitely an increase in the number of overdoses and sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, so let's finish up this very last section. So, yesterday we were talking a little bit about how college students seem to be at the heart of the free speech movement. And a lot of them were upset about all of the issues we really discussed in 10 and 11, but in particular, they were also upset about the draft. They were upset about what they thought was an unfair way to get draft deferments, a postponement of service. And some were just conscientious objectors. They just were not going to go fight in this war that they thought was unjust. So, in response to that, some had to go to jail, some left the country and went to Canada. Many hippies were, in general, doves, people against the war. Okay, so how did the government respond? So these are our last new notes. There are not many today. Well, Nixon decided under this public pressure to quote unquote Vietnamize the war. In other words, he was going to withdraw American troops out and make the war more the responsibility of South Vietnam to keep communism from expanding into South Vietnam. They were going to become more of our client than our, fighting allies. We weren't going to be, we were going to have less and less boots on the ground. And so that gave a lot of young people a lot of hope. Now, strategically, I understand his next decision. In his mind, to prepare for that transition, he wanted to do the South Vietnamese a favor by bombing neighboring Cambodia so that the North Vietnamese had less ability to infiltrate South Vietnam because that was right next to it. But in the eyes of college kids, you just said you were going to essentially shrink our role in this war. And now you've expanded it into the country next to it. So after the bombing of Cambodia, protests popped up all over the place. College campuses all across the country, hundreds of campuses had protests. But the most infamous was at Kent State. And you may know somebody that goes to Kent State. Kent State's only about an hour and 20 minutes away. It is a state school. It used to be really well known for their uh, fashion design and things like that. Today, there's a lot of majors they're pretty strong in. My son, this was one of his top three. This is a pretty common school for kids in our area to go to. And it was the focus of the anti-war protests, unfortunately, because of something that happened there. Now, we get to skip some of this, but I do want you to understand that it just didn't unfold out of nowhere. At Kent State, it starts off with some professional protesters showing up. There were people who went around from campus to campus who did not go to that particular school, who had dropped out of school, and they felt it was their job, their role to protest various things on various college campuses. Sort of like the Freedom Riders, except much more aggressive, not so much into the civil disobedience. Um, I can show you an example of not being in the civil disobedience. This is the ROTC building at Kent State. This is where students go to essentially do the college portion of it's kind of like where you go if you're signing up for the National Guard, maybe you wanted the GI Bill, and it's like this transition point between college and the military. Because that symbolized the military on campus, these outside student protesters burned that building down. So again, very strong difference from the Freedom Riders. They're similar in that they're moving around from spot to spot throughout the country. Very dissimilar in the fact that obviously some of them were resorting to violence. So the National Guard was called into the college campus to deal with this violence that was going on. And the National Guard then announced that there would not be any more protests allowed. Now, in the views of the students from Kent State, outsiders burned down the ROTC building. They wanted to have a campus protest, and they felt it was their constitutional right to peaceably assemble. First Amendment. Now, the government is saying it's not peaceable when you burn down a building. The kids are going to say that wasn't us. This is, this is separate. The students of Kent State who pay thousands of dollars to go here want to have this protest. And the National Guard finally got to the point where they said on May 4th, disperse. We want you to disperse, to move along. And you can see here where they reached a point where several National Guardsmen got in the prone position and had their rifles out, and they were ready to fire upon the students. This particular student, who's probably a professional protester, is actually waving a Viet Cong flag. That's a pretty strong resistance to that. Some of these other protesters who, again, maybe were and were not at Kent State, when they had tear gas fired upon them, they picked it up and threw it back at the National Guard. So the National Guard decided to fire. Now there's some debate about whether or not who gave the order. Was the order given? Did somebody mishear something? But the moral of the story is 68 shots were fired. Now, here's where you need to see a picture of Kent State to sort of make this make sense. This is a modern picture of Kent State University campus. And in the middle, like a lot of Ohio campuses, a lot of campuses across the country they have a middle area here where it's just sort of grass and trees and it's pretty and it's where students gather and in between classes we might eat lunch and it's just a common gathering area. But if you notice, Kent State's is very different from a lot of campuses in that theirs is kind of like a bowl. So the buildings are up all the way around this ridge line in a circle, although you can't see obviously behind us. And honestly, I didn't even understand this entirely until I visited with my son this campus, how much it really set itself up for the unfortunate events that are going to happen by this what looks so pretty but ended up being an unfortunate uh, setup. So this whole campus has this middle section here, and the protesters were on one edge of this but lower. The guardsmen on the opposite side decided to fire these shots over these students. The problem is that when you fire actual rifles, actual gun rounds. And I say actual because today, in crowd control, partially because of this event, they almost never fire live bullets. They fire rubber bullets. Now, rubber bullets don't feel good. Rubber bullets will knock you down. Rubber bullets will. They have been known to kill people because they might hit you in the temple, but they aren't designed to cause bodily damage. And bullets, of course, are. And so when these shots are fired, they do attempt to fire over the heads of these protesters here. But there are several students up here who had nothing to do with the protest, who are coming out of, I believe, a computer lab. And because they fired over the protesters, unfortunately, it traveled, well over half a mile and hit these students and fatally killed several of them. So, sorry, wrong page here. So, what you have is students who were not involved get shot down. And this is a woman who explained later on in an interview, she is screaming and crying because she was literally just talking to her friend and he dropped dead. You Gunshots traveling a great distance, the sound doesn't the bullet is much faster than the sound. She couldn't wrap her head around what had happened. Um, and there were 9 students injured, but these 4 students were fatally wounded. And today there are still memorials in this parking lot where this occurred. But again, and this is a really cool picture where this student is showing a black and white photo to show you exactly where this happened. And this is the modern campus, obviously. And it looks still very similar to the 1970 campus. And they have these spots in these 4 parking spaces, essentially, where these students were killed. And then, of course, they have other memorials. But on students, by the way, who want to honor them, they put pebbles on these light posts here. But this shocked a big part of the country. There's a lot of different ways to look at Kent State, but I think that most people viewed it as, oh my gosh, I can't believe the government just shot and killed 4 college. If you are a hawk, you are somebody for the war, you might say to yourself, well, those kids shouldn't have been protesting. Those kids shouldn't have been throwing rocks or burned down the ROTC building. If you are a hippie, you're like, my God, the government is shooting at us now openly. We're not even trying to hide their disdain for hippies. Most people, it's a nuanced view somewhere in between. Of course, the biggest problem is the people that, not that it would have been acceptable, but the people who were killed were not even the ones who were violently protesting. It just showed this huge rift in our country between the Hawks and the Doves and how people viewed this. Something similar, but less deadly, happened at Jackson State just 2 weeks later, where 12 were injured and 2 were killed. And it showed a really ugly point in our country's history where we were really, truly divided. But pressure from things like this, events like this, continued to make the Vietnam War very unpopular and eventually led to Nixon withdrawing troops from Vietnam because it was just so unpopular among such a big chunk of the American people. Events like this and Tet and some other things made it so that over 50% of the country, at least according to opinion polls at the time, were against it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for notes for the year. That's it for the year. We've got a test on Friday. I encourage you to make sure you are aware of all of your notes so that when we have that test on Friday, you can do the best you can. I know that you're going to be looking things up. I understand that. That's why it's time, though. You will have time to flip through your notes, especially if you've written down the court cases or something like that that you know will be tough to remember. I know that. That's fine. That's in the design of the test. I'm telling you right now, if you don't have the notes, that hour is going to fly by if you think you're going to get on the internet and look up all these answers in time. That's why it's timed. I don't mind you referencing the notes. That's just sort of the reality of where we are and a bonus that you get because you have to go through school in a pandemic. But I'm telling you, I'm warning you, if you try to do it all, if you don't have anything prepped, you're not going to like your grade on that test. So please, please take this time because this is a fairly short day today in class to go through and make sure you know your material. Make sure you know those court cases. Make sure you know some of those letters of those groups. Make sure you know the letters of groups from Unit 10, like the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Tomorrow, I'll talk a little bit about what this is going to look like. There will be no notes tomorrow. And again, you want to make sure you finish up that worksheet that we assigned on Tuesday. I'll be closing that out at some point today. Okay. All right, everybody, get ready for that test on Friday. Make sure your calendar is cleared between 12 and 1. And everybody say, excuse me, between 1 and 2. Ooh, that was close. And everybody stay safe out there.